On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, my film review is Poison, followed by my segment Allow Me to Explain. And it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is Poison, released in 1991, directed by Todd Haynes, starring Edith Meeks, Scott Renderer, Larry Maxwell, and Susan Gale Norman. Here is the synopsis of the film. It is an anthology film that is inspired by the novels of Jean Genet, but are instead original stories that each have some sort of connection. The themes of alienation, the human body, and violence are present in these stories. The first story, Hero, in the style of a 1980s tabloidization report, tells the story of Richard Beacon killing his father and flying away after the killing. The second story, Horror, in the style of a low-budget B-horror movie, tells the story of Thomas Graves, who creates a formula to simulate the sex drive, but instead creates a formula after accidentally ingesting it that turns him into a leper that causes panic in a small community. The third story, Homo, tells the story of John Broome, who has been sent to prison and becomes obsessed with another inmate whom he knew many years ago and falls in love with him. So what do I think of this film? I enjoy watching the film for its quirky and transgressive filmmaking style that became part of what was then called the new queer cinema movement in the early 1990s decade. The first story, Hero, with its low-budget tabloidization interview and documentary-style recreations, is a little bit slow in this film, but it is also fun to watch and it is enjoyable. I enjoyed the second story, Horror, with its use of Dutch angles and deep focus shots as an homage to the B-horror movies of the 1950s decade, while also providing a social commentary on the then AIDS epidemic in the previous decade. It is an enjoyable yet quirky experience as I watch the second story that I find both funny and poignant to see. The third story, Homo, was interesting because it was loosely inspired by one of Jean Genet's story about his life in prison, with the raw sexual energy and also some perverse descriptive details provided by John Broome in the story. It feels poetic yet so unnerving to watch it all the way through. Haynes, as a storyteller, has not only created a film that displays his filmic knowledge of style and technique, but he also inserts or inverts social commentary to provide a point, while also skewering pop culture in his postmodern treatment of handling his stories with his own delicate hands. The film altogether is a non-linear narrative anthology film that switches from one story to another, as well as its style and its use of angles and shots and whatever conventions these genre films have put out on the screen. The style of cinematography within the stories also changes from Technicolor to black and white. For the two stories, Hero and Homo, it was provided by Marius Alberti. The other story, Horror, was provided by Barry Ellsworth in black and white. I admire the changing of the styles to differentiate from the other stories, and also its POV narration that feels so radical and different. I'll give you an example. In the story of Hero and also in Horror, it's all provided in third-person narration, whereas in the story Homo, it's all done in first person. So that's the changing of the perspectives as you watch these three stories differentiate from each other in terms of its narrative flow. Unlike most filmmakers who would repeat the same style and technique and filmmaking in their own work that is original, in this film and in the other films that will follow, since I mentioned the film Carol also by Todd Haynes, they do change and do not remain the same. Haynes' work in this film provides themes of alienation, the human body, either repulsion or attraction or fetishization, or violence that makes this film stand out for its thematic structure that ties the short films all together, as I mentioned before. The performances by the actors in this film are not big-budget Hollywood film actors, but rather local actors and character actors that make this film entirely believable to accept its transgressive and quirky nature. My favorite performances to watch and enjoy in this film is in the Second Story Horror, in which Larry Maxwell is playing Dr. Thomas Graves, and Susan Norman, previously Susan Gale Norman, plays the role of Nancy Olson. They play the roles with a straight face in the style of a 1950s B horror movie that feels so corny at first, but is meant to imitate and pay homage to the style of filmmaking that makes it work so well. Even if what they say in the film may not make a lot of sense to a rational audience, it does so for the purpose of the commentary provided in this film. The performances in the story Hero feel entirely realistic, even though the story about Richard Beacon flying after the murder of his own father sounds ridiculous. But it feels authentic since they blend in with the other local actors to give it that low-budget quality, especially with Edith Meeks, who plays the role of Richard's mother, Felicia Beacon. For the third story, Homo, it feels a little slow at times in the film. I mean, the acting is okay for me to watch. Scott Renderer as John Broome does feel a little stiff in some of his scenes when he is acting alongside his co-star James Lyons, who plays Jack Bolton when they confront each other inside the prison. In terms of its strengths, the production design by Sarah Stolman is amazing to watch. An example is when John Broome is narrating about his time in the reformatory school with all the other males in what appears to be a sound stage surrounded by ruined pillars and greenery for the camera to glide and move in its awe and wonder, and also the music provided by James Bennett enhances this quirky and transgressive nature in the film. The tempo of the score can change from being loud and cacophonic, that's in the horror story, to being calm and soothing in the Homo story. After Todd Haynes graduated from Brown University in 1985 from the Art Semiotics program, Haynes, along with Barry Ellsworth and Christine Vacon, founded the production company Apparatus Productions. The company was used to set up grants for emerging filmmakers who were not served with traditional funding sources. Todd Haynes: "We wanted to preserve the form of short filmmaking and make it something really exciting that wasn't just a stepping stone for feature filmmaking." End quote. Todd Haynes entered the scene with his short film Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story made in 1987. The film was entirely cast with Barbie and Ken dolls playing the roles of the real-life pop figures in the Carpenter family. It was a docudrama about the life of Karen Carpenter and her battle with anorexia that led to her death. However, the film faced controversy after the Carpenter family spoke out against its negative portrayal, and Haynes was faced with a lawsuit, and the film was eventually removed from circulation. It is still available to watch on bootleg copies and can be found online, if you can find it. His next film, Poison, was made on a budget of $250,000 and distributed by Zeitgeist Films. Todd Haynes, in an interview with Cineast magazine, was asked about what was the inspiration for Poison and its narrative structure. Haynes responded, quote, "It's an extension of concerns that were evidenced in Superstar, taking what was a single story and looking at it from different perspectives, both as a pseudo-documentary and subjective montages which are almost experimental. What I found was that the typical viewer could adjust, could switch formats and narrative styles very easily. They had no trouble with that, partly because it was one story, and also, I think, because people are very sophisticated viewers these days. People can read narrative styles and strategies very quickly. I wanted to take that further with Poison, to have different stories and different styles of telling stories without a common plot binding them. I wanted to push it a little further and impose on the viewer the obligation to interpret the film as it goes along and find a reason why these three stories are sharing one film." End quote. In another portion of the interview, he was asked why he chose those three specific genres for his film. Haynes said, quote, "I definitely knew that in one story I wanted to work more explicitly in Genet's world, though I was thinking of a genre in that element as well, the pulp heroic novel. Almost a romance in some ways. The characters are introduced in heroic voiceovers, and Bolton is introduced somewhat self-consciously in a slow pan up his body with a description of his height and weight. But in contrast to that story, I wanted things that were American, stories that I associated with a perspective that was societal. I wanted to least two of the stories to be coming from the dominant perspective of the outcast in the society, one in a documentary style and one in a horror style. These are styles which I think often come out of a need to deal with threats to the social norm, a need to explain them in ways that I think are misleading, but ways that we know really well. So the prison story is definitely in contrast, coming from the perspective of the person who has been shut out, as opposed to reflecting society's opinions about what deviance or what transgression is. That's basically what informed my choices. I didn't really waffle a lot on different kind of stories. I settled on those styles pretty quickly, end quote. When asked if he was looking for an emotional response from the audience, Haynes replied, quote, "Yes, definitely. I think what makes Poison really work for some people is that it gets under your skin and makes you feel something, usually something very sad or disturbed. For other people, though, that doesn't happen. For some people, it's an intellectual game. It's just, oh, the documentary and the horror one are very funny, and the other one is serious all the way through. In some sense, it's a very conventional, very mainstream, very Hollywood wish on my part that the film saddens you and becomes more than what you're seeing. Maybe by the end or by the last third. If it doesn't touch you in some way, if it ultimately doesn't overcome its structure, its intelligence, its cleverness, I would be unhappy." The film made its debut at the Sundance Film Festival in January 1991. The film won the Grand Jury Prize. The film was given a limited release on April 5, 1991. However, the film provoked controversy from the religious right, including Reverend Donald Wildman and his organization, American Family Association, that launched a campaign against the National Endowment for the Arts. He stated after he learned that the film was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts that the film contained, quote, "explicit porno scenes of homosexuals involved in anal sex," unquote, which turned out to be false. I will say that as a viewer watching this film, that it is a quirky and offbeat film that still manages to address the themes related to the LGBTQIA+ community, while at the same time experimenting with style and genre in a free-flowing, non-linear narrative that somehow makes it work. Despite a few slow scenes and some stiff performances, it is an impressive film to watch. I will give a shout out to its writing, direction, cinematography, production design, performances, and music that gave the film its strong points. We will be right back with my segment, Allow Me to Explain. Earlier this month, the Florida Senate dropped a new elections bill that is at least 98 pages long, known as Senate Bill 7050, that critics say will actually make it harder to vote, including Gen Z voters who are key to the voting process. So what are the new changes to the election bill that Florida Senate Republicans want to pass, and how will it affect the upcoming election in 2024? It's time for Allow Me to Explain. In early April, Florida Republicans in the state Senate dropped a last-minute 98-page bill that would fundamentally change the election laws in the state of Florida for the upcoming 2024 election. When it comes to the changes that would make it even more hard to vote for the upcoming election, they include reducing the number of days for a third-party voter organization to deliver an application to voters in 10 days. If it is delivered a day or so after, they would be fined $50 per day, reaching to a maximum of $2,500. The groups must provide a receipt for each applicant that has accepted the application. To make it even worse, the third-party voter groups have to re-register with the state of Florida for every election cycle. Another new requirement under this proposal in the election bill is that for first-time Florida voters who have never been given a current and valid Florida driver's license, voter ID, or social security number to vote in person for the first time. One of those individuals who has a concern with the new requirement under this proposal is Jayan D'Onofrio, a high school student who is part of the group Florida Voters of Tomorrow. During the Senate committee hearing on the bill, he stated that the restrictions on having a voter ID or driver's license would affect thousands of voters. The response from the voting rights groups came swift and hard against these new provisions in the GOP election bill. Quote, "It does seem extremely punitive to the third-party organizations. The League is one, and we've trained many others. They've come to us and said that they can't bear the burden that the state is unfairly putting on them with these increased fines," end quote. That was Cecile Schoon, president of the League of Women Voters of Florida, expressing concern about this bill. Another group that came out against this bill was Common Cause Florida. Amy Keith, program director of the organization, said, quote, "This bill is not a recipe for a well-run election. It severely reduces access to third-party voting registration organizations who have long assisted associated with voter registration in lower income and marginalized communities, end quote. The bill only arrived on Monday afternoon before it was heard for the first time in the Senate Ethics and Elections Committee at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. State Senator and sponsor of the bill, Danny Burgess, stated that prudence was the reason why the bill arrived halfway through the legislative session. He stated after the bill dropped, quote, "We're on day 29 and we do have over halfway to still be able to go through session with simple stops. We really want to make sure to get this bill right," end quote. Another provision that is added in this bill deals with vote-by-mail ballots, in which it states that if 2 or more vote-by-mail ballots are returned in one mailing envelope for the same election, neither ballot should be counted. It also puts the responsibility on current voters in the state of Florida whether they are legally eligible to vote. It also states that voter information cards must contain, quote, "a specified statement that the card is proof of registration but is not legal verification of eligibility," end quote. Jonathan Weber, Florida Policy Director with the SPLC, also known as Southern Poverty Law Center, said in an interview with Florida Phoenix, quote, "This bill overshadows the apparent obligation of authorities like the supervisors of elections and Secretary of State to tell people whether they are or are not legally eligible to vote by placing the onus on the voter to make that different determination amongst our state's labyrinthine of eligibility laws. For many in Florida, voting will now be a roll of the dice. How many will ask themselves, is it worth it, and decide to stay home," end quote. Jasmine Burney Clark, founder of Equal Ground, a black-led voting rights organization, stated that the new bill is a continuation of the voter-suppressed bills that were passed by the Florida legislature for the past 2 decades. Quote, "In 2018, 1.8 million returning citizens through a citizens ballot initiative were given the right to automatic rights restoration, and in 2019, a poll tax was implemented by the legislature. In 2020, black voters utilized drop boxes at a rate of 8.4% higher than previous elections, and in 2021, the legislature passed SB 90, limiting the use of drop boxes. Here we are in 2023, and this legislature is introducing another voter suppression bill. Voter suppression impacts everyone, including your own base," end quote. State Senator Tina Polsky stated that the bill is not intended to make it easier for anyone to vote. Quote, "With regard to third-party organizations, each year we make it harder and harder for them to operate, and they do help people in lower income groups and out there in communities," end quote, while also expressing her disappointment in how the bill was presented to the legislature and the public. The bill passed the Senate Ethics and Election Committee on a party line vote. It is currently sitting in the Fiscal Policy Committee in the state Senate. So what can be done about this, and how to get your voice out there on this issue? The best way to reach out is to call your state senators and representatives to tell them to oppose this bill. Create helpful videos and posts on your social media accounts, whether it be on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, or maybe on Twitter, to get the word out. Check out Democracy Docket to keep yourself on high alert about where this bill will be headed next. Go to their website at www.democracydocket.com for more information. Other organizations that you can help out with include When We All Vote at whenweallvote.org for more information, Common Cause at www.commoncause.org for more information. For the state of Florida, go to www.commoncause.org/Florida/ to take action. League of Women Voters is also another organization that you can help with for the cause by visiting their website at lwvfl.org. There is so much at stake because of how the wheels are turning for the upcoming 2024 election and what it would mean for the state of Florida and how it will affect our key demographic groups that are essential for a healthy and functional democracy when it comes to voting rights. This is an issue that should be front and center of not just what it is happening in the state of Florida, but in other states that are controlled by the GOP. We need a better tomorrow to make sure that our democracy is not crumbled in front of us, but protected by the younger crowd and demographic. This has been Allow Me to Explain. On the next episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, it's a Jordan Ramirez minisode. Jordan Ramirez recommends Boy and the World, airing this Monday at 12 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public every Friday. And my minisodes, Jordan Ramirez recommends every Monday at 12 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. And just as a reminder to make sure to like and subscribe to my podcast on Spotify. Make sure to go to my blog website at filmtalkwithjordanramirezpodcast.wordpress.com with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. Check out my YouTube channel as well, Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, and please make sure to like and subscribe. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.